Thanks, everybody, for joining me on this special episode with Dr. Lydia McGrew. Today, we're going to be talking about 7 bad epistemological habits of New Testament scholars. And Lydia, I'm excited to have you on the show yet again. Why don't you tell me just like a little bit, for those who don't know you, a little bit about your background and your interest in New Testament studies and just how you got into this.
So I've been publishing in epistemology, theory of knowledge, since the early '00s, around the turn of the century. And I've published jointly with my husband, Tim, but I've also published quite a number of articles singly in theory of knowledge, and then also formal theory of knowledge, which is a little different and involves probability. Back in 2016 or thereabouts, I got very interested in what's become known as the argument from undesigned coincidences, and Tim got me interested in that and really excited about it. So that was kind of the way I moved into New Testament. So I wrote and published Hidden in Plain View in 2017, and then I was kind of off and running, and I started realizing all of these surprising problems in New Testament studies, which I considered that I was having a special insight to because of my background in epistemology. And I found that it was surprisingly hard to get people to really take note of those and really consider changing them, especially when these problems were being used by evangelical scholars. Then there was this kind of wagon circling that took place. So I came to consider it was really important, and especially concerning the Gospel of John, because like everybody was dumping on the Gospel of John. So in then I published The Mirror or the Mask. And then I published The Eye of the Beholder, which is The Eye of the Beholder is all about John. And then most recently, Testimonies to the Truth. And all that time, in parallel, I was also publishing in formal epistemology. So kind of keeping those two tracks going at the same time. So I really think I'm bringing sort of this outsider view, but then in a way that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, you would think somebody who has some specialization and background in the field of epistemology, that could only be a good thing. But you're right. I do see a lot of like wagon circling. You and Tim obviously have been involved in like, philosophical kind of circles for a long time, writing in philosophical journals and doing these, giving presentations and this, that, and the other. And so I'm just kind of curious. This is just something that kind of popped in my head as a somewhat of an aside here. But do you find there's like more resistance with New Testament scholarship versus like when you criticize like another philosopher on their idea about, I don't know, it could be like a theory of time or one of their favorite arguments for the existence of God, and maybe you think, oh, I don't think that's a very good argument, and you criticize that. Do you feel like there's just more resistance in the field of biblical scholarship than there is in like the field of philosophy? It seems like, to me at least, my experience, philosophers just seem to be a little more chill about having their ideas being scrutinized. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, if I could put it this way, there's something very masculine about especially analytic philosophy. An anecdote I like to tell, even though I wasn't there, I heard it from Tim. He went to speak at, I believe it was Wayne State University, and this was years ago. I think it was probably at least 15 years ago. I wasn't there. And they actually bragged to him that they had had a different philosopher there and that they had made this other philosopher cry. It's like a secular, this is all secular. And they're like, yeah, I think the other philosopher was Crispin Wright. And they're like, yeah, we made him cry. And so it's this almost kind of agonistic thing, like, hey, bam, bam, bam. Okay, we're done. Let's all go out for beers. So that you kind of go at it, you get into the ring and you give it your best shot, and then you're all supposed to be friends afterwards, and that's what I expected when I came into New Testament that's just what scholars are like, and then it turns out that isn't just in general what all scholars are like.
Yeah, it's just I don't know. It's strange the defensiveness that I've witnessed, but I mean, it's not like with everybody, but it does seem to be kind of a pervasive thing. And so, but the reason why I wanted to have you on and give this particular talk, which we're going to jump into in a minute, and actually Lydia is just going to take over and run through some slides. So I'll just be kind of watching in the background, and then we'll bring her back on and have a little bit of a conversation. But there's this idea that's out there, this just kind of in the air, that basically biblical scholars are like they're kind of like wearing lab coats or something, like there's this perception that New Testament studies is just like this unbiased discipline, almost like physics that just kind of keeps piling up knowledge bit by bit over time. And someone like yourself who is an outsider, or just me who I'm just a guy who's interested in this stuff, can just be called like, you're just a YouTuber, or what do you know? You're just a philosopher. You get all this pushback when you criticize somebody like Bart Ehrman or Paula Friedrichsen, or even a Christian scholar that you think might have some wrong ideas. And so it's like people automatically side with the experts. But obviously the whole point of this presentation is that this discipline, as you mentioned already, as you dug into this, you found like, wow, like there is a lot of weird stuff that's going on here, like questionable underpinnings to this whole discipline. And so, did you want to comment on that before we kind of jump in, or is that
I
kind of a
think we'll
good?
see it. I think we'll see it, as we go through. Certainly, it's not the case that uh, some consensus in biblical studies is like a planet or a new particle or something where they're all just out there sort of looking at it and we can all see that it's there. It's much less cut and dried than that. And often I will also point out that it is not the case that all New Testament scholars agree with one another. So then you have to pick, and it's interesting to see the kind of arbitrariness there is. Then someone who's just influenced a person or whatever becomes, the authority, and there may be other people who are just as highly qualified as that person who think differently. So you kind of have to get into it more even to choose which authority you're going to agree with.
Yeah, it's not as cut and dried, I think, as people make it out to be. And I think it's just maybe this common idea that, like, trust the experts. That's just kind of, people take that into other areas, and then they bring that into biblical studies and go, well, it must be the same. Well, I think in this day and age, a lot of people are like, maybe we should question some of the experts, but we'll just leave that aside. But without further ado, why don't we bring on your presentation here? Like you said, we'll see it by example. And then, like I said, everybody will just kind of jump in, have a short discussion afterwards, and just wrap up. So
7 epistemological bad habits of New Testament scholars. All right.
All right.
These are not in any one particular order. So we could take them in a different order if we wanted to, but I just picked 7 for convenience sake. So I'm going to start with what I call arguments from silence against data. Now, I want to distinguish this from an argument from the absence of all data. So, for example, suppose that someone asked me, do you believe that right now there is a man walking by in front of your house with 2 dogs on a leash, and one of them is a Schnauzer and one of them is a Collie? And I would say, well, no, I don't have any reason to believe that. So, no, I don't believe it. Now, that's an argument from the absence of all data, and it's really an argument from specificity. It's not just an argument from silence, but it's that something this specific has a burden of proof, and there's no satisfaction of that burden of proof. But now contrast that with taking the silence of one source and setting it against the actual declaration of another source. So suppose that my husband and one of my adult daughters they've both been out during the day driving cars, different cars, and Tim comes back, let's say, and he says, wow, there was this big accident out on Cork Street, which is a street right near our house. And he said, police cars and everything. And I even had to take a little detour to get home. And then a while later, my daughter comes home and she's just talking about her class, her college class, and she doesn't say anything about the accident. Do I say, well, because she didn't mention it, then only Tim mentioned it, so probably it didn't happen because she would have mentioned it if it had happened? That is an argument from silence against data, and it's a really bad argument because she could just be interested in her class, or maybe the accident had already been cleared up or something by the time she was coming home. So the fact that she doesn't mention it is not a good reason to discount the fact that he did mention it. So an example here, Bart Ehrman just loves to do this, specifically about the Gospel of John. And he'll do it in debates. He'll say, now in the Gospel of John, you find all of these really strong statements. Before Abraham was, I am, I and the Father are one, and so forth. And you don't find these in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are called the synoptics. And he'll say, surely, if Jesus had really said these, then the synoptics would also record them. Surely, what are we to make of this? And so what he's doing is he's taking the silence of the synoptics and he's setting it against the data from the Gospel of John. And I often point out, not even a miracle for Jesus to be saying that. It's just a man standing there saying something, But he treats it like the only possible way to satisfy a burden of proof that Jesus even said that would be for it to be recorded more than once. And that's making quite a set of assumptions. And Tim has an article, it's a secular article on arguments from silence, in which he points out that we really need to calibrate in history, that often we'll think, surely, as Dr. Ehrman says, so-and-so would have mentioned that, surely Ulysses S. Grant would have mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation, and then he just didn't. But that doesn't mean that we think it didn't happen. And there are a lot of other examples like that. So we need to calibrate in history our assumption that surely someone would have mentioned something. Okay. Secondly, cherry picking to create developments. Now, anybody who's following my YouTube channel right now knows that I'm doing a whole series on this. It's called Development Theories of the Gospels Are All Bunk. And so this has to do with saying that the Gospels get gradually more and then fill in the blank as we go forward in time. So one example I talked about on my channel, that Jesus supposedly gets more in control of his death and less suffering as we go from Mark, Matthew, Luke, and finally John. And it's astonishing because there will be, in many cases, strong counterexamples to the alleged development, and they just get either not mentioned or explained away in a very ad hoc way. So in this case, for example, the only gospel in which Jesus expresses physical pain on the cross is actually John, and where he says he's thirsty. So exactly the opposite of the development claim. And then they have to find some way around that. Allegedly, Matthew redacts Mark in the service of a higher Christology. So these very tiny verbal differences, like where Mark says that Jesus could not do any miracles in a certain town because of unbelief. Matthew says he did not do many miracles because of unbelief. That tiny wording difference is put down to Matthew being uncomfortable with the idea that Jesus was limited in his power. But then they'll ignore a big counterexample, which is that in the wording in Mark, when the high priest asks Jesus, are you the Christ, the Son of God? He says, I am. And he actually uses the ego eimi. Now, I mean, it's in Greek. He may have been, in fact, speaking Aramaic. But the point is, if this were the other way around, if that I am were in Matthew, or even more if it were in John, it would be questioned. But in fact, it's in Mark, and we find Matthew, same question, same answer, same incident, records Jesus as saying, you have said it. So I think these are just variations. They're not heavy. We don't have to look for a motive, and you have to cherry pick to avoid these counterexamples. Okay. A bias against generally similar events. This is absolutely huge. It's just a huge bias. I often tell this story about a correspondence and email with a Christian biblical scholar, and he brought up Jesus being rejected at the town of Nazareth. And I said, looking at it, it looked to me like those were probably two different occasions in Luke, and then in, I think it's Matthew and Mark. They just don't look to me like the same incident. And he said, how often are you going to do that? And I thought that was so interesting, because it's like, is there a limit? I mean, the only possible answer that one could give would be as often as the evidence warrants it. So we find generally similar events happening all the time in real life. And I'm just talking generally similar. Political protests, going to the grocery store and having a conversation with the cashier or whatever, similar kind of conversation. And in the Gospels, Jesus' temple cleansing, very clearly tagged to the beginning of his ministry in John, very clearly tagged to the end of his ministry in the Synoptics, and it's not uncannily similar. It's not like he has the very same dialogue with everybody. It just describes these general similarities. He turns over the tables and stuff, but there are differences as well. And so there's no reason to doubt, actually, that this happened twice, but that's treated with great scorn. Like, oh, brother, you must be a real dummy to think that this happened twice. And I want to introduce some common sense to say, how often do generally similar things happen twice or even more than twice in your life? Okay. Number 4, preference for complex over simple theories. This is a big one. It's almost like it's more likely to be really complex. There was one time when Dale Allison was being interviewed, and he said that because he couldn't think of anything to do with the pillow in where Jesus is sleeping in the boat on a pillow, so he wasn't automatically going to say that was made up. So in other words, the limit on what we're going to say is invented then is going to be our own creativity, right? So we're assuming that they're always changing something for some heavy reason, and then we got to get real creative, try to think of what that motive might be. So trivial differences of wording attributed to deliberate literary or theological agendas. I already talked about he did not do any miracles versus he could not do any miracles. This is my beloved son versus you are my beloved son. Extremely trivial wording difference, and we're assuming that Matthew deliberately changed it to this is he's trying to make it more personal for his readers, something like that. Like there's got to be a reason, as opposed to just, even if he was using the Gospel of Mark, he glanced away for a moment and he wrote it down approximately as he was remembering it. Or he talked to someone different who remembered it with an extremely trivial difference. Similarly, there's this claim that Matthew or Luke deliberately changed the story of the centurion. Either Luke made up the intermediaries, that's what some scholars think, or Matthew deliberately tried to make it look like the centurion came to Jesus in person, even though Matthew knew he didn't. Now notice my view in this case is that Matthew probably misunderstood something that he was told. I don't think he was there. I think there's evidence here that he wasn't there. I can even imagine how he could have misunderstood. We can talk about that afterward if you want to. But so this shows that I'm not just trying to retain inerrancy here. Sometimes an error is actually the simplest explanation. And it could be just a plain, we might call it plain error, a good faith error, not an elaborate literary redaction. So again, there's this misconception that if you're going to resist these trends of scholarship, you're doing it because you're conservative and you're a fundamentalist or something like that. Whereas, rather amusingly, I find sometimes a resistance to my idea that there was an error um, from surprising quarters. So when he was responding to me in a series he did some years ago, Dr. Lacona was talking about this, Dr. Mike Lacona, about this passage with the centurion, and he said, I don't know of any scholar that thinks that Matthew made an error. It was almost like it was a shocking idea. We'd rather think that they had some heavy reason for changing it deliberately. So that's a preference for complex over simple theories. All right, bias against harmonization. Any attempt to harmonize two or more accounts is ridiculed as proceeding merely from a theological commitment, even though harmonization is completely licit and valuable in secular contexts. There's a footnote that I've read a number of times on my YouTube channel in Dr. Dale Allison's most recent book, where he just levels the most blatant ad hominem. He's talking about John Wyndham and Jake O'Donnell, I think it is, or O'Connell, who harmonized the resurrection stories. And he points out that they both say that they are inerrantists. And so he says that their attempt to harmonize can only be explained by a commitment to a certain view of inspiration. So it's just an absolutely blatant ad hominem, which nobody else seems to really call him out for. And that's not true. I mean, again, as in my case, I'm not even an inerrantist. Moreover, we can see that in secular contexts, this makes a lot of sense. So I've been recently reading some excerpts from some, or summaries, I guess I should say, of some Holocaust memoirs. I've been reading a preview copy of a book on the Gospel of Luke, where the author is comparing Luke to some of these Holocaust memoirs. And there are things like, for example, these women who traveled on the same, cattle car transport to Auschwitz, leaving on the same day, September 3rd, I believe it was 1944. And one of them talks about the kindness that the people showed to one another and the way that, the men would clear a space so that elderly people could sit down, for example. Whereas one of the other women talks about the way that people mistreated one another and their unkindness towards one another. Now, that's exactly the kind of thing that would get jumped on by scholars. Or one person who knew Otto Frank, who was Anne Frank's father, describes him during this time period as depressed, as well he might be. While another person who knew him during the same time period describes him as an optimist. Now, that's exactly the kind of thing that you get, well, was Jesus depressed or was he an optimist? It depends on what gospel you read. You could just hear Dr. Ehrman saying that. Tim likes to talk about an account by a bunch of newspaper people of the same audience that President Calvin Coolidge gave to a bunch of newspaper people as they came filing in. And, one of them said he was sitting. Another one said he was standing. One of them said he didn't smile. Another one said he did smile, and so forth. Of course, these are all easily harmonizable. There's not anything wrong with saying that Otto Frank may have been depressed at some points and an optimist at other points, and that people on the horrible cattle cars some of the people may have been kind, other people may have been cruel and selfish, and that's just the way human nature is. So those are really harmonizations. And it's really funny because I'll have people writing to me, and I imagine, Eric, you probably do too, saying, is harmonization used in secular history, or is it just something we do with the Gospels? And, on the contrary, it's with the Gospels that harmonization is questioned. In the secular context, we do it so reflexively that we don't even call it harmonization. It doesn't even get a special name because it's so obviously reasonable. Okay. 6, no concept of holistic reliability. So we saw this some weeks ago when Jonathan McClatchy was talking about holistic reliability on a skeptical show, and it was claimed that Jonathan said that either these books are 100% reliable or they're 100% unreliable. But that's not what that means. The point is, for something to be reliable is not for it to be necessarily without error. Being without error would be kind of your maximal level, but a person or a document can be very highly reliable without being inerrant. Um, but we learn to evaluate people this way. So I talk about this in connection with what I call a Bayes factor, which is a measure of force. How much force does it have to me if my husband tells me about that car accident? It's got a pretty high measure of force, um, certainly enough to overcome any, you know, general burden of proof. Like, okay, this is a specific event. Did it really happen? Yeah, if he tells me he saw it, probably did happen. Um, so that doesn't mean that the Gospels are necessarily perfect, um, but it is incredibly difficult. I find it almost impossible sometimes, and sometimes even for Christians, to get them to understand the notion of reliability. So um, this is especially relevant for John because there's this concept of what I call the passage by passage approach to historicity. So this is just considered a methodological absolute in historical Jesus studies. It arose from the quest for the historical Jesus in its various levels. And there's sort of rules of thumb, if something is multiply attested or if it's embarrassing or whatever. And by itself, there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, if it's embarrassing, it's especially unlikely to be invented. But that doesn't mean it has to fulfill one of these special criteria. So, a number of weeks ago, Dr. William Lane Craig actually was asked as a question, why don't you use, I believe it was, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me, from John. And he said, well, that's because I only want to use those sayings of Jesus for which a good historical case can be made. And it's like, okay, so very, very clear. He was saying that a good historical case cannot be made that Jesus said that. That doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't believe it, but if he does, it's for some reason other than by a quote unquote good historical case. And it's pretty clear, and this fits with what he says similarly in Reasonable Faith, that he's tying the notion of a good historical case to this passage by passage method, as opposed to a general notion the Gospel of John is reliable. There's nothing overwhelmingly unlikely about Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Or, you know, um, no man comes to the Father but by me. So if John says that Jesus said it, that's got a strong force because we know elsewhere in all sorts of other ways that John had access to the event. So, Jesus probably said it. That's just, and that is a good historical case. It's like almost impossible for people to understand that could be a good historical case. And it's not a special Christian way of thinking. Okay, and then finally, last habit I'm going to discuss today, something that I call the statistical fallacy. This is my term. You won't find this in the literature. This is the false assumption that different gospels are claiming to give us a statistically representative sample of how often Jesus used certain words or phrases, like the phrase eternal life, or types of teaching, like parables. And that is then used to create a sort of a faux contradiction, a statistical contradiction, because some ways of talking are found more often in some gospels than in others. So it's like an unstated assumption that when you start reading any gospel, Mark or Matthew or Luke or John, as if there's this little asterisk at the beginning that says, if Jesus is represented in this document as using a phrase m times out of n sayings, then the actual proportion within Jesus' ministry of his using this phrase is m out of n. For all sayings, m out of n of them really were use the phrase eternal life, which of course is ridiculous. No document is claiming any such thing. So if eternal life is used somewhat more often in John than it is used in the synoptics, it is in fact found in both, and not only in Jesus' mouth. Even in the synoptics, you find other people using the phrase too. That's fine. These can all be historical or parables. John probably was aware of the synoptics and thought that those story parables, a certain man had two sons, etc., were very well represented by the other gospels, and he didn't need to keep telling more of them. But I've literally seen it said in one blog post that Dr. Lacona wrote about the Gospel of John. He actually cited a verse from the synoptics where it said, without a parable, Jesus did not speak to the people. And, obviously that wasn't intended to be absolutely literal. Like, Jesus never literally opened his mouth without using a parable. And then he said, it's very notable that Jesus doesn't tell any parables in John. Like, makes you think, and no, it doesn't make you think, anything. It doesn't call any question upon the full reportage model of the Gospel of John. Obviously, that verse in the synoptics, it can be hyperbolic, indicating Jesus just often spoke in parables, and B, I would say in the context, it's pretty clearly talking about that particular day. He's been teaching from the boat, using the boat as like a podium, and he's like telling a lot of parables that day. So this statistical fallacy creates phony contradictions that aren't really contradictions at all. Okay, what is the moral of the story? So, like in VeggieTales, the moral of the story is the point we hope we've made. All right, biblical studies is a substantive field. Like all disciplines, it influences its practitioners in social ways as well as by genuine discoveries. Frank examination from the perspective of analytic philosophy discloses a number of epistemological pathologies that are perversely treated as disciplinary norms, from which one departs in a more conservative direction only due to fundamentalism. In this way, the discipline discourages healthy internal critique, leaving it to outsiders to notice these problems and to bring new light to the subject matter. There is no substitute for getting one's hands dirty and investigating the issues in detail rather than uncritically accepting a disciplinary consensus. That is, if you're interested in knowing the truth about these matters. So that's my rather swift summary of the 7 epistemological bad habits.
Well, cool. There lots of really good information there. I was thinking, kind of going back to the argument from silence, it's such a prevalent thing with New Testament scholars. It's like you can almost like just sit through one of their talks or their discussions on like a podcast or something like that, and like, okay, you can make it into a drinking game almost, or like within 10 minutes they're going to give an argument from silence. Like for an example that I heard from Paula Friedrichsen, she said that the author of Acts, which I would say would be Luke, is inventing things because the whole stoning of Stephen. Well, like why doesn't Paul mention that in his epistles? Wasn't that a big deal, the stoning of Stephen? And I'm just like, stop it. You just kind of want to be like, why do you keep doing that?
Or they'll use it as an argument for some motive. Like, I don't remember the name of this person, but it was just brought to my attention recently that somebody did a video on Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist, and that the Christians weren't comfortable with Jesus being baptized, allegedly. And that then you get to the Gospel of John, and that even though John the Baptist alludes to the Holy Spirit descending on Jesus and so forth, he doesn't actually say in so many words, I baptized him,
Hmm.
right? And that this is the baptism is disappearing in John as a sign of theological discomfort with the baptism. So it wasn't even clear that he was saying the baptism didn't happen, but the argument from silence was being used in this other way to show like some kind of a redactive agenda of discomfort with the baptism,
Yeah.
and because of high Christology.
Yeah. Why is it just, do the, why is this so prevalent? I mean, like, why do you think? Is it just like these people don't really take the time to just take like a formal logic class before they jump into New Testament studies? Or they just, if they did have it in college or whatever, they just forgot it? It's just, I guess for the life of me, I don't understand why this is continually trotted out there. Like it's some kind of like really strong argument when it's just, it's almost always bad. You know what I mean?
Yes, well, because it's being used sometimes very often against data, as I
Yeah.
was saying. Um, a lot of this is social. A lot of times, the only answer we can give to why is, you know, it's like if you have bad habits in a given family, like if people are always mean to one another, why are they so mean to one another? Well, because that's what they learned from the time they were kids. And this argument from silence, that's what they learned from the time they were, you know, PhD students,
Hmm.
right? So it's a disciplinary habit, and people are great imitators, great mimics. You're trying to learn the discipline. You sometimes even subconsciously pick up on what the older scholars or older people. I'm sure people do it in sports. I'm sure they do it in I don't know, firefighters. What do the more experienced firefighters do? And they imitate that. So I think a lot of it is imitation. I think also there's a real failure to distinguish different arguments from silence. I have a video. It's called "Arguments from Silence: The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly."
Hmm.
And so, sometimes, like that example I gave, I'm not just going to arbitrarily believe that there's a guy walking past my house with two highly specific dog breeds on a leash without any evidence at all. And so then that gets ported over, and then it's assumed that we could do this in a completely different epistemological context. So they're not being taught nuance in the application.
Gotcha. Yeah. It probably is just a sociological thing. No, that makes sense. Going to where you talked about the centurion, and like you're not just coming at this from like a rigid fundamentalist standpoint. You're not, you personally are not an inerrantist. Although I think the inerrantists like you because you have such a high view of the reportage model and it's so compatible with inerrancy. But it's strange to me that somehow inerrancy is compatible with the idea that either Luke or Matthew was making something up or inventing something for some sort of theological motive or whatever. And so I don't know if like maybe people fail to see that when you start saying that this is what the gospel writers did, how that has big implications. I mean, if you're, especially for people, if you're a big resurrection like apologist, like a Dr. Mike Licona, but you're endorsing these kind of theories, like wouldn't, if you're inventing things, adding things, changing things, wouldn't the resurrection narratives be like where they would do that the most? And doesn't that like weaken your case? And so I don't know, maybe if you could speak to that just a little bit.
Well, the whole inerrancy thing, I think, has caused tremendous confusion in this area. A lot of people have to sign an inerrancy statement to keep their jobs,
Hmm.
or to be members of their church, for example. And so then what becomes valued is the label more than the substance of what the label stands for. And it's been sort of an astonishment to me that people seem to think it's more important that someone claims that inerrancy label, even if the definition has been rather radically changed,
Hmm.
then if they just would come out and say, I know what was meant when this statement of faith was originally written. And on that concept, no, I'm not an inerrantist anymore. That's, sort of more shocking. And so then there's this huge temptation to change the definition even quite radically, and it's almost a pun. It's almost to the point of being a pun. Well, an error is something you do by accident. If this was done on purpose, it's not an error
Yeah.
anymore. Okay, and I mean, it's it's crazy to think that you would be saying that, because obviously that's not what it originally meant.
Mhm.
And there is a video out there. I think it's Bart Ehrman and Derek from Myth Vision, and they're talking about this. And Bart brings this exact thing up. He
Mhm.
says, it's something like, well, they did it on purpose. It's not an error. And they're like, really? And they're like laughing at it, but it is. It's almost unintentionally funny.
Yeah.
Um, because obviously what was originally meant by an error was erroneous information that fails to correspond to fact and to the way things really are. And under that heading, a good faith error is actually less of a problem for reliability than a deliberate change, because when it's deliberate change made for some highly subjective reason, it's very difficult to know when the person is next going to feel like making a highly subjective change.
Mhm.
Whereas we have a pretty good idea, I think, of what kinds of good faith errors people make if they're generally well informed and close to the facts and so forth.
Yeah, and that goes kind of ties into the holistic reliability versus this passage by passage approach, because you're saying like over and over and over again, these guys are showing themselves to be knowledgeable and well informed and close up to the facts. They know what they're talking about. They get multiple things right, and we would expect in eyewitness testimony that sometimes there's just a good faith mistake. Somebody misremembers something. They're not intentionally like fabricating something, and so to me, yeah, that's way more less of a price tag than this other stuff. But it's like a lot of these, not to bash on evangelical scholars, but I just want people in the audience to know these are bad habits that are like across the board. We're not just saying, like these are the skeptics and the atheists, and they're just biased against the supernatural. This stuff is really kind of spread with this whole like criteriological approach. Like everything has just got to be verified, like every single story we got to have like all the different criteria. Could you kind of, for maybe people in the audience who aren't familiar, could you kind of talk about a little bit more detail what the passage by passage approach is and kind of where it came from and why evangelicals are kind of stuck using it now in a kind of a weird rigid way?
Yeah, good question. So, um, the quest for the historical Jesus, of course, had been going on for a while, and sometimes people will talk about the first quest, the second quest, the third quest, and um, historically speaking, um, the quest for the historical Jesus involved the assumption that the Gospels aren't reliable. I
Mm.
mean, I think we should just admit that as documents, they contain lots of false stuff. But then there was this notion like, well, but can we still find history in them? Is there stuff in them that's true? So it would be sort of like, if I watched a movie about Robin Hood, it's just a movie, but there may be some things in it that are really true. Like maybe there really was a guy named Robin of Locksley who was an outlaw or something like that. So then they developed these criteria, and they change. The list changes, it gets tweaked, they get debated in the journals and stuff. So it hasn't remained the same all this time. But where if something satisfies at least one and preferably two of these, um, then it's considered that it's probably historical. But then, of course, we can debate, well, I don't really agree that it satisfies. I don't think that's really all that embarrassing. So I don't think it does satisfy the criterion of embarrassment or something like that. Or one person says there should be two criteria and another person is satisfied with one, and so forth. So different examples would be multiple attestation. If you've got different traditions or sources that you think are independent, that are both saying the same thing happened. Embarrassment, if something is like something the Christians probably wouldn't consider advantageous, but they put it in there anyway. Um, Palestinian environment is one, that it's consonant with what we otherwise know about the original cultural environment. So, as you can see, there's nothing per se wrong about most of these. Now, one that I really don't like is the criterion of double dissimilarity, where something's supposed to be both dissimilar from its original, from the original Jewish context, but also dissimilar from later Christian teaching. I mean, that one, it's very hard to apply that one in a good way, but many of them are legitimate as far as they go. And I say, if you're going to use that, you say it's especially unlikely to be made up. That's how I like to use the phrase. It's especially unlikely to be made up. But the problem was that this took on a life of its own. And then there were a couple of different negative approaches you could take if something didn't satisfy these criteria. One would be, then it didn't happen. So that's your sort of Jesus seminar, very negative approach. If we can't get it to satisfy, and it's like every saying of Jesus is evaluated separately, or every miracle story or incident, evaluated separately. So the very negative is, then it probably didn't happen. But there's a different and subtler negative approach that I believe even Christians use. And I talk about this in chapter 8 of The Eye of the Beholder, if you get a hold of it. And this is the idea that if it doesn't satisfy at least one of these criteria in this list, we should be agnostic. It cannot be shown to be true objectively, historically, and it cannot be shown to be false objectively, historically. So maybe if you're a Christian, you might feel that the Holy Spirit leads you to believe that this really happened, or because you are a Christian, then in a special Christian way, you believe this because you think it's the word of God or something. But from an objective historical perspective, we have to present. We have to say historians cannot say. It is impossible to know. And I believe that it's the second thing that Dr. Craig was meaning recently when he said that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me, does not have a good or a strong historical case that can be made. What he meant was that because it doesn't satisfy these criteria, then from a historical perspective, we cannot affirm it or deny it. If we're going to affirm it or deny it, we're going to do it because of some other worldview consideration or something like that. So what he's essentially doing is he's tying the possibility of giving a good, strong historical argument to this set of criteria as if that's the only objective way of really being able to say, yes, it definitely happened. And I just don't agree that that's not the, I just don't agree that that is the only objective way to say, yes, in all probability, this really happened.
Yeah, and I think I worry from a practical standpoint, because I've even had like Christians tell me like, well, when I'm reading certain passages of the Gospels that don't meet the criteria, like in their head, they're like, well, did this really happen? Or did this, like, I've literally had people who are into apologetics, like begin to almost question stuff. And it's like, they don't read the Gospel of John anymore. They just kind of, well, Mark is the earliest, so I guess that's the best one, kind of thing. And it's like you're really like robbing yourself from a lot of good stuff. And it's like, there's also this divided mind that I think that is kind of coming across of like, well, you better believe what Jesus said based on good historical evidence. You better believe what he did is based on some pretty good historical evidence. And if you're throwing out holistic reliability, and you're just saying, well, I just know because the Holy Ghost, has inspired it, then I feel like you're just kind of in living with some kind of cognitive dissonance. And it's just not like a posture I would recommend for anybody. And so I'm really glad that you brought that up, because it's just not something that I don't think is very well understood. And sadly, even in apologetic circles. So,
yeah, I've had people write to me too and say, now this doesn't satisfy, I forget which one I was asked about. I think it might have been the guard at the tomb in Matthew. This doesn't satisfy any of the criteria of reliability. So criteria of authenticity. Do you think this really happened? I was like, whoa, wait a minute. Is that how you're using those criteria? Like you have to have it. So we need to get a different idea of what constitutes a good historical case.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think these are tools that everybody can use. I know for myself, I mean, knowing these particular habits, when you sit down and you watch these different podcasts or videos, different YouTube channels with these New Testament scholars, and they have all these credentials, but they're making these arguments. My hope for the viewers here is that they're able to identify these. I know, I mean, even in my response to James Tabor, one of the things that he said was, Mark has the Sabbath is made for man, but man for the Sabbath. And Matthew just takes that out because he hates that. He's a good Jew and he likes the Sabbath. And so he very specifically does this intentional, I'm going to take this out because this really grinds my gears kind of thing. And so because of that, you've given a similar talk like a while ago. This one's kind of a little bit more expanded. I was able to be like, and it just seems like a lot of this redactionary stuff, it's almost always these minuscule, tiny, insignificant wording of details, as if people in real life don't paraphrase or don't say things just a little bit different or don't remember things a little bit differently. And so I think that one of the things that you're doing is you're just kind of bringing, common sense back to what we're looking at here, instead of everything's got to be heavy, everything's got to be literary, everything's got to be redactive. Even the other day I had some comments because I just asked like a quiz question of like, how many fish did they catch after the resurrection? And it was 153, and like people were arguing in my comments what the 153 symbolized. And I'm like, maybe it was just 153 fish, like. So
well, they had to clean their nets, so
yeah.
you have to get the fish out of the nets, before you can clean it. So since they knew that it was an exceptionally large catch, I mean, just like fishermen nowadays, they'll get their little ruler, their little slide rule, wherever, they'll measure the fish or they'll weigh the fish and they'll take a selfie with the fish. You can imagine them going, 122, 123, 124, because it's what guys do.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
it's what people who are interested in what they're doing, their profession, it's what they do.
Right, exactly. With redaction criticism, I mean, just maybe one final question. Like, do you feel like it's just kind of like a wax nose that just basically you could just kind of grab it and just do whatever you want with it to come up with some kind of motive? It just seems like there is like no controls on it whatsoever. It's just kind of do whatever you want with it kind of thing. Is that a fair kind of criticism?
Well, I think it is. And I gave this talk a weekish ago, can't remember the exact day, for a different closed group. And there was someone, I think he was just an agnostic, but he works in the sciences, and he talked about degrees of freedom. And that was the phrase that he used that gets used in the sciences, that if a whole bunch of different things can fit your theory, and you can make almost anything fit your theory, then that's not very good evidence for your theory. And so he was saying that it sounded like that's what's going on in these cases. And I think that is what you mean by a wax nose. There are far too many degrees of freedom. So I try to be really cautious when someone asks me, why do you think the synoptic authors don't include the I am saints or something like that? And I'll say, I don't know, maybe this, maybe that, but I try to be very careful, very cautious, and not to get too committed. And so if something is going to require me to commit to a highly conjectural motive, then I probably should not go there. I probably should only hold that very lightly. But in the redaction criticism area, they don't hold it lightly. That same footnote I was talking about in Dr. Allison's book, right there in that footnote, he said it's very dispiriting, I think that was his phrase, to see people trying to harmonize the gospel resurrection narratives. And he said something like, it's as though the successes of redaction criticism and attributing differences in the gospels to editorial agendas were an illusion. And I'm like, Yeah, actually, it is. It is an illusion, and it was like he thought he could just say that,
Yeah.
and the reader was supposed to go, "Oh, yeah, that's bad." It's as if they think it's just an illusion, and
Yeah.
that's where you really need the little boy to stand up and say the emperor has no clothes and that it is an illusion.
Yeah, I mean, some of the examples are just crazy. I mean, another one from Tabor is he said like the widow with two mites, like Matthew took that out because, again, he's such a good Jew, and how could she outgive like everybody who was giving in the temple? And it's just like
For goodness sake.
maybe Matthew's just running out of scroll and just didn't want to like include that. Like, why is there this heavy motive
Right, and
ascribed?
there
Yeah,
is special material, as he no doubt knows. There's
sure,
material in Matthew that's not in Mark.
right.
And so if you're going to have material that's not in Mark, then you're not going to include all the material that is in Mark,
Yeah, yeah.
It's sort of obvious.
It's just kind of crazy. And so, well, I think this has been really helpful. And so I really appreciate you coming on and doing this. I would encourage people go back, watch this more than once. These particular habits, you're going to see them come up again and again and again and again and again. And it's one thing I know with apologetics, it can kind of become whack-a-mole, like, what do you think about this objection? Answer this objection. What do you think about this objection? Answer this objection. If you can notice the patterns, if you can notice the habits, if you can notice the mistakes that these scholars constantly are falling into, then you can pick these patterns out yourself and identify them yourself. And you don't need to like ask me or email whoever your favorite apologist and be like, well, what do you think about this? Identifying these habits is going to be like so helpful for you. And so one thing, Lydia, I did want to definitely plug is check out Lydia's channel. Just search Lydia McGrew channel. All kinds of really good videos every Sunday. And so usually every Sunday on these particular issues with New Testament. Sometimes you get into some other things with, natural theology and whatnot. And so check those out. And then particularly the two books that would be most pertinent to this discussion, although all of Lydia's books are really good. And I highly recommend Testimonies to the Truth if you're just getting started and interested in these things. But check out Eye of the Beholder and Mirror and the Mask, because you really do get into a lot of these bad habits. And this is kind of where you really start pulling these things apart more and more. And so highly recommend those books. And I'll be sure to put a link to those in the description to Amazon so you can check those out. And so, thank you guys so much for joining us. Lydia, do you have any parting words for us or?
I think that really wraps it up. And I just want to say thank you to Eric, who helps with the podcast, because it takes the audio content, puts it over on Anchor FM. And so
Yep.
shout out right there to my host.
Yeah, in case you didn't know, you can get Lydia's episodes. It's on Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts, Apple Podcasts. And so honestly, I was sort of selfish because I'm like, I don't want to pay for premium, which is kind of bad because I'm a YouTuber. You think I would want to pay for premium and all that other stuff because I know it helps people with their ad revenue. But I just wanted to be able to mow the yard or do chores and be able to still watch without having to, if I stick my phone in my pocket or whatever, it just doesn't stop. And so there were some selfish motives going on there. But anyway, definitely check that out. I'll also put a link to that in the description. And thank you guys so much for watching. And I hope you have a great day.